So I see we have 23 of us. That's great. I'm going to ask that you all use your private chat to let me know that you're here today so that I can take roll without calling each of your names and taking up time that way. So all you need to do is send me in the chat, choose to me and write your name. I guess you don't even have to write your name since your name will be there, but just, I'm gonna use that to call roll. So, and we'll be doing this probably for the rest of the semester, just to save a little bit of time here at the beginning. Secondly, I'm really sorry about last week. That was a total mistake. I wasted an hour of our class time by mistake, and I apologize. If I do something silly like that again, please do let me know that it's happening. So I want to start off with talking about the Kamoinge group. Kamoinge group. Each member seems to pronounce it differently. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and how do I make you all? How do I make you all co-hosts? Let's see.
Can I ask a question first?
Sure. Yes.
Okay, I will pronounce it Kamoinge. It sounds Kenyan enough. And I had a problem with communication because I sent you an email with the work like on Sunday, and then you sent like 11 o'clock, I think it was Monday, this Blackboard platform. And I spent like 10 hours trying to send you the work, and I really wouldn't like to have another day like this in my life. I mean,
yeah, I understand.
It didn't get the work, and then I sent something, I don't know, even at 10 o'clock at night, something was received, I don't know even what. I tried to compress it, I zip it. It was really not something I would like to spend my life with.
Well, no, I get it. And it is, as I think I mentioned the first week, one of the worst pieces of software I've ever had to deal with, next to, as I said, CUNY first. But that was kind of my fault because I set up the assignment without adding a way for you to submit it. And so Cole was kind enough to point that out to me. And later on, I redid it with a submission click, like a way to upload your submission. And so I deleted the first one and made the submission in Blackboard. So it should be working now. And if it's not working now, don't spend 10 hours of your life on that ever again. If some, I can't always answer emails immediately, and I apologize about that. I try to get to them within 24 hours. It is, those assignments in particular, there's not a late penalty for submitting them late. So those windows will be open until the end of the semester for you to upload those VRE assignments specifically. So there's no like rush to get them up, and if you don't get them up by class day, it's not late, and there'll be no penalty. I hope that helps. Is that enough to? Yeah, one more. Go ahead.
How do I know if you got it? I send a mail and I'm sorry I insist on it, but it's a homework. I try to.
No, I get it. I understand. You should get a confirmation from Blackboard that says that you would that it had been submitted properly.
No, I did get, but since I was he didn't accept the file. So I zipped it once and it didn't accept it. So then I compressed it and I don't know what's in there actually. Something was sent. I don't know what was sent. So
Okay.
I'm sorry if, I don't know if I have to do homework, I want to know that it's got where it has to go. So that's why I asked.
Hey, this is Cole. I'm just gonna say, if anyone has trouble with Blackboard, I was helping out some of my professors with it last semester, so I'm pretty cool with it. I'm gonna drop my email in the chat. Just email me if you're having problems, okay?
Okay, thank you, Cole. I really appreciate that. So let's just sort of talk about the actual exhibition briefly. And we can, if you have more questions about Blackboard or submitting your assignments, either ask me or Cole, either during my office hours or via email or whatever's convenient for you. Okay. So is anyone sort of really gung-ho to show me something that you made in response to the show, to the exhibition? Yes, go ahead. I see Gracie. Okay.
Yes.
I'm gonna make you a co-host so you can sort of share your screen.
Let me just pull it up. Okay. My internet will work now. Sorry. Okay, here it is. And I had trouble sharing my screen yesterday, but let's see if it works.
Okay. Wow.
So this was a digital painting that I did on my iPad. And I was inspired by a lot of the artists that I saw. Two that I can point out in particular, I hope I say them right, were Edgar Cohen's. He had one of his photos, it was like the American flag. It was almost like a double exposure type of photography. And then another photo that I got inspiration was from Louis Draper. And he kind of had the sheets. I think it was called Congressional Gathering. So I kind of wanted to incorporate, obviously the portraits, because most of the artists, I believe they use portraits, black and white photography, headshots. So I kind of, tried to make this double exposure, kind of looking picture using my brushes. You see the figure on the right over here kind of overlapping with this one. And I wanted to hint at the congressional meeting photo. I tried to make like this impression of the drapery over the faces, if you can kind of see that pulling through a little bit. But those were like the two main things that stood out to me that I kind of wanted to pull in, because I thought they really highlighted the exhibition for me. So
Fantastic.
That's what I was working on.
Really, I love the way you're talking about it. The thing you made is really wonderful, like just technically, and like the concept behind it. It really shows me that you looked at the artists and thought about them and then made a response to them. In your case, with the picture, this is exactly what I'm looking for in the idea of the visual research exercises, or the VREs. So I love the way you sort of discussed how you brought the two different photographers together into the same piece here, and it's just a wonderful image. It's a great use of black and white. You used the transparency, the overlaying sort of thing that you said double exposure. Double exposures always make me think sort of like of dreams somehow, the way that ideas get mashed up in your dreams. The ideas get mashed up in layered, in your case, digital painting or double exposure photography. So it's really Great. So exactly
you.
what I'm looking for. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Who else is interested in showing me something? Call out your name if you are. I don't have everybody's screen visible, so. Anybody else?
Professor, this is Lena.
Hi, Lena. All right.
I'm on my phone right now and I'm not able to share, but I thought we were writing something.
I gave you the option to either make or write something.
Okay, okay.
Okay. So, Lena, what did you think of the show? What sort of struck you the most?
I thought I wanted to go in person better because looking at it on the computer is you're limited to the way you feel when you look at a picture, and the way they arrange the picture in the museum is very different. So I know I will get another perspective by going inside and looking at all the pictures. The group picture that they have is, I realize that not everybody's looking at the camera. And I think it's strategically that they did it like that. And everyone, you can tell the character by the self-portrait. So you can tell who is who. You can tell like what they're trying to convey just by looking at the pictures.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So,
I don't know if I can share on the screen. How do you do it?
I have to make you a co-host. So, let me see here. Is Go?
Yes, I'm Gogo and I'm you.
Trying to find you. Here we are. Okay, so you're a co-host now. So you should be able to click the share screen button at the bottom.
Okay, so then I go to, so I can go to my files, right?
Right, it should be open already. So you need to open it and then you'll be able to share that window.
Do you see anything?
We see you.
So how do I share the file? So maybe, I don't know how to share the file.
Lenore, it's like how we did in our class yesterday. You're gonna share the screen at the bottom, the green.
First of all, open the file so that's open in a window.
Okay, I have it.
Now go down to that green button that says share screen. It sort of has an up arrow.
Okay, I think I don't know how to do it. So maybe I won't waste you. I have it in a book, in the book files.
But is it open?
Yes, I opened it. It's open.
So when you hit the green button that says share screen, it should give you a display of all of the open windows on your
yes.
Right. So then you click on the one that is the one you want to share.
Is that a bookmark? I don't know if it says book. I don't know. No, I think I don't know how to do it, and I feel embarrassed to waste your time.
So we'll move on to someone else. Is anyone else interested in sharing?
I'd be happy to share.
Great.
Yeah, mine's a poem. So I'll just put it up and there's also a photo I took that people can look at.
I see Omari's hands up as well. So.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to share some ideas about what I thought about
Okay, well, let's let Cole do it and you'll be next, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you guys see it?
Yeah, it's a little hard to read, I think, depending on the size of people's screens. So
can you zoom in a little bit?
Yes, I certainly can. Okay, and let me know when you need to scroll down.
So while we're sort of reading it, can you tell us a little bit about what sort of struck you the most about the exhibition? I know that you had seen the lectures as well. Did you go to the show?
I have not been to the show in person, actually. I've just been to the lectures and I've just seen it online. So I have not, yes, I haven't been there in person, unfortunately. But I was definitely struck by how much of the show it is portraiture, how much we see of people's faces and the different ways in which aspects of them are highlighted. I tend to think about photography as like a moment in time that kind of collapses like someone's life into that moment, and you get like just this quick shot into what they're experiencing and what they're living, and so I think that's what I got as I was scrolling through all the many images, just these little windows into people's lived experiences, which was really cool to see.
Great. So just talk briefly about the picture you made. Maybe scroll up a little.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So this is an image. It's just an iPhone picture. I'm not a photographer at all. But it is it's of a garden, a community garden that is in the Bronx, up near where my where one of my doctor's offices is. And I walk by there, or I used to all the time, and now I do every once in a while. And when the NYC community gardens give me that feeling as well, that I'm getting this moment to see into someone's life and like what matters really to them. And then just formally, I was struck by the similarity in the shape between the links of the fence, and then the shape of the boy's mouth in Herbert Randall's Harlem, New York. So I had that formal comparison there too.
Great. I mean, I think that the chain link fence is very much an urban sort of icon. We often seem to be looking through a fence, either from the outside in or the inside out in the city. And that's sort of what struck me so much about this sharp, chain link fence in the foreground and this sort of vague background, which really works kind of nicely against the chain link fence. So thank you very much. So Omar,
Good, I'm so glad.
Omar, you had something to say?
Oh yeah, definitely. I guess what struck me the most from, I guess, the exhibition was basically how candid everything, well, not everything. Like for instance, I liked Albert Fenar's work, and specifically, which one was it? It was Urge Negroes to Unite. I mean, it was all of this stuff is basically like, I took it as like a snapshot of my everyday travels, because coming from these neighborhoods, a lot of these scenes are, I guess, often overlooked, the everyday neighborhood vibe that, like if you're in it and you're in these neighborhoods, you get to see, I guess, the buildings. And back, I guess, during that time, during the 1960s, I appreciated like the formal attire, even though the neighborhoods were, maybe ghettoed or whatever the case is. Everybody had on a suit, like the girls would dress nice and proper. And, it's the juxtaposition of time basically to see, how we've, I guess, evolved, or, however, anyone's perspective is on that. But I was, more taken aback by like, I guess, the candid approach, because I guess when I was taking photography classes at Lehman, at one point, I would emphasize that I love, the candid option, because you get to freeze, like Cole said, a moment in time. So say if someone's happy, or if there's a revolution, and that was a revolutionary time back then, dealing with, I guess, what was it, civil rights and equality, things of that nature. So it's just really like a gritty period, where maybe the buildings weren't as pretty, but everybody was dressed beautifully, you know, or maybe like now where the buildings are so beautiful and technology is at its highest, but we, you know, I wear sweatsuits and things like that. Like the dress code has changed up somewhat. So I was just really taken aback by, you know, how they were able to capture in black and white, you know, because that makes things more, you know, symbolic and artistic. So I appreciated that. And another one, a picture that I liked was the Betty Shabazz and Percy Sutton at the Malcolm X's funeral. That picture was nice because you can't see anything going on behind them. So it's like they're coming out of the tomb like that Jesus was laid in, you know, like they're coming for the viewing and then it's completely black and then they're coming out into a foreground that's, you know, lit and beautifully exposed. I mean, it was a tragic moment, but I guess the picture said 1,000 words. So I took a lot from, I guess, each artist, but those are like the main ones. I love the candid nature of it, and I love how expressive and, you know, documentary.
Okay, wonderful. You know, that what you just said, you know, if that was what you had submitted as a written document, would be perfect. And, you know, we've seen a couple of pictures already, but, you know, what you just said, for those of you that don't make art, that kind of writing, that kind of personal response to the work is what I'm looking for in these visual response exercises. I think you brought up something that's really important. You didn't say the word, but I'm going to use the word of representation, that these photographers were able to sort of show their world. And that world wasn't usually seen from the people who lived in that world's point of view, but instead usually from a white photographer looking in from the outside. And that these photographers who were living the experience that they were photographing were sort of being able to sort of share their experience. And it's a much more intimate and kind of way of seeing those neighborhoods, those street people, than most of the pictures at the time were. And so I think that's one of the most important things about this exhibition is that we're seeing Black photographers represent Black people from their own point of view. And that to me is why this is so important. That, you know, for years, as I said, really on the first few sentences of class last week, you know, the history of photography doesn't represent other cultures very well. And that especially the first 100 years or so of the history of photography is primarily from a sort of white Western European point of view. And so I was happy that this show was up this semester so we could start with this to see that there are other visions and views that maybe were made, but they weren't necessarily published or they weren't necessarily given attention. So I see, Edith, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to share my piece of what I decided to do with the visual representation.
Okay, you're a co-host now.
I decided. So one of my favorite ones was created by Anthony Barboza, and he has this one picture of Mink Smith, which is one of the other photographers, and from what I looked like to me, it was in Harlem on the Malcolm X Boulevard because of the background of the picture. And when I saw it, kind of just reminded me like how common it felt. Like it kind of just gave me a feeling of like I could relate even though I wasn't there, but I could understand the picture or understand the time in a way that I live in New York, and I know I know that area like firsthand because I've been there. And it was just like, just by the picture, I was able to tell what part of New York it was. And it wasn't like written in the description or anything. So I thought it was pretty cool. So I decided to recreate the picture as my assignment. And I went to Malcolm X Boulevard. Of course, it's kind of hard to find the exact location because of the generational time difference, of course. But I ended up stopping somewhere where I can show you the picture.
Please do, yeah.
So this is the picture that he took.
Okay.
on this side, on the left. Can you guys see both pictures? Yeah. On the
Just-
left side is the picture that he took, and then on this side is the picture I took. I kind of
we
course,
only
I
see
couldn't
one
find.
picture. We only see one picture.
Oh,
We see the original.
how do I go back?
Is that a different window?
Yeah, I'm going to it now.
Okay.
Can you guys see it?
Yes, now we see.
Okay, so that's the picture I decided to take on Malcolm X Boulevard. I didn't really, because of the gentrification of the area, I kind of wanted to catch something that represented Harlem to me. And the picture is a little overexposed, but on the back it shows a hair braiding salon. And that's to the left of me. And then on the other side, oh, well, it kind of cut off. But on the other side, it was a picture of graffiti of Harlem, NYC. That it said Harlem, NYC, and it was really nice to see, I guess. And I felt like that was just the perfect way to kind of recreate the picture, but not exactly create the picture because I don't know where the location was. And yeah,
Right. Really, that's wonderful. I like the image a lot, and I immediately noticed the hair salon as a sort of icon of certain neighborhoods in New York, and kind of liked that you had overexposed it and then jacked up the contrast and made it black and white. That sort of gave it a really interesting sort of feeling that seemed kind of, appropriate with the image you were.
yeah, I also decided to keep my mask on to represent that we are in COVID, but then like even though times are so different, of course, we still have that sense of common reality. And I forgot my train of thought, sorry.
That's great. I mean, really wonderful. So everything I've seen so far is really, I think, exactly what I was hoping the exercise would do. You look at the pictures, you think about them, and then you give your personal response to them. And it's not sort of like a document of, this picture describes a little boy on the street doing X, Y, or Z, but instead, it's your personal response. So that's exactly what I like to see.
Can I make a comment?
I want to show.
Gracie, go ahead.
Gracie, go.
I just wanted to say that I really loved like how you're saying that even though you didn't know exactly where the original photo was taken, you were able to recognize where it was, even though, things have completely changed. Because it was just last week that I lived in Yonkers for the beginning of my life, and then I moved out, but I saw a picture of Yonkers from the 1950s, and I was like, wow, I would never be able to recognize that now, like where I'm from. So I think it's really great that you were able to make that connection, and you were able to locate, you were able to make that distinction without knowing where those exact, buildings were in that photograph. I just think that really shows your connection and your passion, for knowing that history.
Right, great.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead. Somebody had their hand up.
Yes, Omar said candid, and I chose what really touched me. I chose a candid picture of Miles Davis that one of the photographers, Herb Robinson, it was like his rite of passage into the Camoens group, and he took it backstage in a very unlit, one bulb lit corridor in the backstage of the Village Vanguard. And this photograph really evoked or conjured a lot of memories, very vivid memories in me. I compared it to and he said in his interview for the Virginia Museum, where the show was shown first, he said that when he took the picture, Miles Davis took a fist to him. He didn't want him, because Miles Davis, in a way, he was the greatest improvisation, but he was a control freak. He controlled the structure of the music, the sound, and his image. He really controlled his image. So I confronted this candid image to Irving Penn, very well posed and premeditated image of Miles Davis, if you remember the one that is like this. And this same image is on a poster of a concert I saw. I'm a very old lady, so I got to see him at 87 in a concert where the poster is with this picture of Irving Penn. And I put in where I write, it was in the Caesarean Roman theater in Israel. I'm Israeli. And Miles Davis playing the trumpet goes back towards the columns and enters a limousine and leaves while the orchestra goes on playing. And he was always very great in finishing, you know, the phrase in a very surprising way. So I put this picture, and then I remember all the nights we spent listening to his vinyls or vinyls. We had like 50 of them on those days. And I finished with this same poster when my daughter went to college. She's now near you. She is in Colombia. She took the poster with her, and I asked her to send me the picture of this poster 40 years later in her room. And so it's like circling from a candid image. And actually this photographer lived in the same building she lived before, near the Bronx, and he couldn't change his light bulb, and we helped him to change the light bulb because you had to climb the stairs. He was also, this is it, the story, it's a circle.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that Miles Davis picture was more of like a blurry impression coming out of the darkness than, and it was really kind of like hard immediately to discern what was going on. But then after you looked for a few moments, you could sort of begin to see a figure sort of coming out of complete darkness. So I want to just move on from this, but I want to make a couple of comments, things that didn't come up in any of your, I do see that, Gregory, do you have a comment you want to make?
I just wanted to share mine before we moved on.
Okay, I've lost your screen here, so we're gonna have to go kind of quickly with the last couple of people. So there you are. I'm gonna make you co-host. Okay, there you go. You're a co-host now. All right. So while he's getting ready and loading up his picture, I just want to say a couple of things. You know, the thing that hasn't come up that really struck me about it was the fact that they were a cooperative, right? That they were a group that met together every Sunday. Maybe not everybody came every Sunday, but you know, for year after year after year, there was a group of people who would meet, bring pictures, talk about pictures, critique each other's work, hopefully gently, but it sounded like not always gently. That there was a kind of you know, healthy competition that sometimes maybe wasn't always friendly, but they always became friends afterwards, eventually like a family that kept coming up. This idea that the group was a family and that they could argue with each other and then sort of love each other at the same time. And I thought that was really wonderful. I know that for me as an artist and for me as a teacher, the most important things I can do for my students is to create an environment where that sort of camaraderie happens, where there's a sort of mutual appreciation, but also a kind of mutual like competitiveness that happens. I think that's the worst thing we've lost in the COVID virtual world of art teaching, is that kind of environment, that kind of friendly competitiveness that happens when we're all in the dark room together, or we're all doing a critique in the same room together. And so that aspect of the sort of cooperative spirit, you know, really is, I think, one of the reasons that made the group so special. And it probably pushed these photographers in places they might have not have ever gone without that kind of a group to encourage each other, to scold each other, to sort of critique each other, both gently and not so gently. So that was one thing. It also seemed that Lou Draper, he kept being mentioned in all of the interviews as seemingly the personality that drew everyone together, that that everybody loved Lou. Apparently, unfortunately, I mean, he died before the exhibition, so we didn't get to sort of meet him through his interview. But you know, and it's often the case that there is some kind of, you know, central personality that causes these moments in the history of art. I mean, if you think about like the you know, Paris in the 20s, you know, there was oh, the female writer, I forget her name, but she had all these dinner parties and all the artists sort of came to her house, and that's how they all met each other in Paris in the 20s. And you know, in New York City in the 50s and 60s, there was the Oak Tavern down in Greenwich Village, where all the macho abstract expressionist painters kind of all met and drank and talked. And again, there was this kind of confluence of ideas and personalities and people that all sort of got together at the same time. And this group seems to be another one of those times when a group of people with similar but different ideas yes, Gertrude Stein, thank you. And you know, that this group seemed to have that kind of feeling as well, that there was this central personality, Lou Draper, who brought all these different kinds of photographers together, and they built something larger than each individual photographer might have ever done. So, I think that's what's really fantastic about it. Gregory, did you want to say something? Is that, who was next? I forgot. Okay.
Yes, can you guys see my screen?
Yes, yes. The Grace Jones picture?
Yes, this is my favorite picture. I'm actually a seasoned photographer. I've been taking photos for a few years now, professionally. And this reminded me of one of the photos I had previously taken in my own way, of course, which is what I chose, like Edith, to replicate and respond to the artist. So this is the original photo of Grace Jones taken by Anthony Barboza, who is to me my favorite artist of the whole exhibition. I replicated it with my own version and style from one of my models that I took, and this is my response to it.
Cool, that's great. These are called low-key pictures, right? These images with lots of darkness and just a little bit of brightness coming out of the dark. This is a lovely image though.
Thank you. What I love about his image is that his was more natural. Mine, I used Photoshop and I altered it afterwards, which is something more modern that we do now.
Sure, sure. But they, you know, they talked a lot about how Lou would teach them to dodge and burn, and you know, process their film properly, and you know, so the mid 19th century or the mid 20th century version of Photoshop was the darkroom, and we still have a lot of controls in there that are you know, dodging and burning specifically, that lighten and darken places in a picture, which is, you know, very similar to what you can do in Photoshop. So
I just wanted to say that I think the exhibition, one of the main things that I took away from it is that I can relate to them more than if they were just American people saying it. Most of the struggles and the things that they mentioned, what really drove me to Anthony Barboza was when he said that I had such bad grades that I didn't even bother going to college. That really struck me as a Dominican male who is one of the first people who's going to college right now. And that was really what drove me to try to understand his art a little bit more. And when I saw the photo of Grace Jones, I immediately know that he was the one I connected with the most.
well, that's awesome. I thought that that might resonate with some of the students in the class. It was that was the first interview that I watched, and it was yeah. So I'm afraid we're going to have to move on so that we can get back to the sort of sequence of the course. But I'm really excited and thrilled by what I've seen today. So yes, I see some clapping going on in the chat, and I think that that's exactly right. So thank you all very much. There is a place in Blackboard for you to submit these. They're essentially going to be graded, you did it or you didn't do it. So there won't be like a letter grade assigned or anything. You'll either get the 5 points or you won't. The other thing is I will assign 4 of these during the semester, but you can only get 15 points. So that means essentially that if you do all 4, you'll get 20 points. But if you miss one, it's not, the end of the world either. So, that's kind of where we are. So I'm going to go back to.
I'm sorry, Professor, did you want us to email them to you, the written statements, or?
No, I specifically don't want that actually. In Blackboard, there is an assignment with a button you can click to upload your written or visual response to the exhibition. And so I'd like everybody to put them into Blackboard that way.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to get back to where we were when I ended class too soon last week. And so I'm going to go for a very fast review of where we were. If you remember, the lecture was primarily about pre-photography, what happened before we had photography. And we talked about camera obscuras. We saw that the idea of the camera obscura had been known for at least 2,000 years. That some contemporary photographers still use camera obscuras for their own sort of unique purposes. That the camera obscura became more portable. It went from a room to a box to sort of what we think of today as a camera, which is really just a small dark room, right? Remember, camera is room and obscura is dark, so it's really just room dark, which of course in English we know which would be a dark room. The camera lucida I mentioned briefly, which isn't really a camera, but uses a kind of prism essentially to make it seem that what's in front of you is also on the paper where your hand is, and that this was a much more portable thing. We talked about the idea of the grand tour. Remember, this was a kind of thing that people, when they finished college, we kind of call it a gap year now. You'll finish your education and you'll go abroad for a period of time to sort of see the culture of Europe in this case. And remember, I also mentioned that most of the first part of the history of photography happens in Europe. And I'll talk more about that as we go on, but that the idea of the grand tour really sort of contributed to the idea of photography, because people wanted to have records of their travels. We talked about how some artists like Vermeer used optical devices to make their paintings, and also this Van Dyck. Was that Van Dyck? No, it's the Arnolfini wedding, right? And so how we can tell that artists did this because of certain ways that light refracts on metal, on glass. These are things called specular highlights that the human eye does not see, but only a lens sees them. So we're fairly certain that these artists were using some kind of a camera with a lens in it to help them. And I just started to talk about the tableau vivant, which, remember, is a kind of entertainment that would happen. As I explained, last week, it took a day or more to get to your friend's house, sometimes 3 or 4 days to take, a horse and buggy to your cousin's house in another part of wherever you were. And so people didn't go just for an afternoon or for dinner. They would spend a week or even 2 weeks there visiting. And since there was no internet or television or movies and a lot of people, by the way, couldn't read, they would put on these kind of tableau vivants. These essentially, it's like a single frame of a play, right? There's no like action or speaking lines or anything. They would just all kind of like pick a scene from something, maybe Shakespeare, maybe the Bible, who knows? And they would sort of dress up. They would get the, open the dress up box and put together these kind of, which, they're really campy. First of all, I think that's one of the things that I noticed right away. And campy, by the way, is a term that sort of came out of Susan Sontag's writing about certain types of overly dramatic theater, often that came out of the gay community. And the word camp has been used since the 60s to describe these kind of sort of overly dramatic kinds of things. It would often be, by the way, young women, Victorian women were very, not always, as we see here, but Victorian women specifically were very, kept in a very small box. And so they didn't have a lot of entertainment. And so this was one of their more, one of the few things they could actually do for fun, and the whole families would participate, multiple generations would participate in these things. And then of course, the camera came along and people began to photograph these. Now, the pictures that I'm showing you are after the invention of photography, obviously, but this was a thing that people did before photography was invented for entertainment. And so these are more recent ones that obviously the images are quite much better. So, and this is still a thing that some people do for fun. They'll sort of set up these things. And this is one, and I'm gonna talk about this image in another context, but this image, we brought up Photoshop a few minutes ago. All of the characters in this picture, by the way, were played by the photographer, who's the old man in the center and the old man on the left with the bald head. His maid, who played all of the female characters, and his manservant. Wouldn't it be nice to have a manservant, right? And his manservant. So there were 3 people who played all of these roles. All of the images were taken separately and independently and then seamed together to create this image. It's called The 2 Ways of Life. And so the reason I bring this up is that the kind of art that was being painted in the mid 19th century when this picture was made was these big grand narrative paintings. And they were often very large scale, by the way. If you see them in the Louvre in Paris or anywhere else in the world, they're like 40 feet long and 12 feet high, and they're just massive in scale. And they would always have a storyline, and they would tell the story of a war or the story of a something poetic or something. But in this case, the story is of a father in the center who's trying to guide his son towards the on our right. We'll see piety represented by the woman with her hands in prayer, hard work represented by the man with the hand tool. We'll see worldliness represented by the globe. We'll see charity represented by the woman helping the bandaged person. And so those are the things. In the one I love is just below the boy is modesty, right? So the maid has got a cloth over her eyes so that she won't even see her own body, because somehow that would be sinful if she saw her own naked body. So that represents modesty. Now on the other side of the painting, the son is sort of got his arm up, and it's a word I don't get to use except when I talk about this picture. He's hearkening, right? Isn't that a fun word? Hearkening, a very 19th century word, to the other side of life. So on the other side of life, we see sloth, we see sexuality, we see gambling, we see basically all the sort of deadly sins, if you will. And so the story of the painting is that the father figure in the center is trying to guide the son towards the good things on the right and keep him from the bad things on the left. And so it's a kind of tableau vivant, right? We've taken a group of figures, set them up in a way that tells a story. And so narrative storytelling was very popular in 19th century painting, in early 19th century painting. So here's a more modern one based on the Raft of the Medusa, done in 2009, which, if you know that painting, it's a very sort of kind of violent but sensual painting. It's, again, another huge painting if you see it in person. And so these people are sort of taking on the gestures and the shapes and the forms of some of the figures in the painting. And so even more contemporary are other artists who are doing sort of performance and installation art that's very similar to the idea of the tableau vivant, right? Performance art, a lot of times, it happens for a specific period of time in a specific period in a specific place. And when it's over, it's over. There's no like experiencing it the same as if you were there when it was happening. So, and Vanessa Beecroft being, I mean, I should probably take her out of this because stuff she's done since then, I'm not so keen on, but you know, she often sort of does these massive installations using live models that, you know, again, it's kind of like, it's a very different experience to see a picture of large groups of naked people as opposed to being there in person during these kinds of things. So I mentioned the Grand Tour, and I just want to talk more about it because it really is one of the huge catalysts for photography. And again, this was something that happened to, I want to reiterate that there was a very small percentage, the so-called 1% of people who went to college back then. The colleges were basically Oxford and Cambridge in England. And Thomas Cook, who was a sort of banker, and you can still get Thomas Cook traveler's checks. You know, he sort of invented the path that became the very the standard Grand Tour path. And so from about 1660 till the 1840s, when rails came along, this would take a year, sometimes maybe more, because it was all done horseback, you know, on a horse-drawn carriage. The roads sucked because they didn't have them paved yet. And so over time, what happened was they sort of standardized the tour. And this red line here sort of represents what the Grand Tour would be. You'd start in London and you'd end up somewhere down in sort of southern Italy. And you'd stop and you'd see, you know, Paris, and you'd see all the sort of grand European, Western European specifically, pieces of, culture, the greatest things in the world. And then usually when you did this tour and you went home, that would be the last time you would travel. Like, this was not like we travel maybe every other year. We take a vacation somewhere on short vacations on weekends to go to the beach or something. But no, this was like a once in a lifetime thing. You did it once, you never did it again. And so people really wanted to have something to remind them of that for the rest of their lives. And if you couldn't draw, which, by the way, that was part of being an educated person at the time, was drawing was an essential part of being a college graduate. But if you weren't very good at drawing, like this guy Fox Talbot that we'll talk about in a minute, then you wanted some other thing to do. And so, the itinerary was basically from London to Belgium to France, and you'd go to the Alps, and you'd go sort of see the Seine in Paris, and up the Rhine to Basel in Germany. And so this was kind of, a long trip. As I said, it took a year to do it. And so since it lasted for hundreds of years, hotels catering to people doing the Grand Tour would begin to appear. And so people would make the same kind of stops along the way. And I'll come back to the Grand Tour and its importance in a moment, but other things that were happening before we knew how to use the camera obscura to fix an image, right? We knew the camera obscura's theory, but we didn't know how to, other than draw it, how to capture the image. Were some other interesting things. One of these is this is one of my favorites. It's called Magic Lantern shows. These were essentially drawings on glass that would be a sort of theatrical presentation. They could be, pastoral and quaint and soothing, or more interestingly, they could involve like devils and phantoms and macabre objects. Now, this would go along with sound effects, smoke effects, gunshots. There would be a narrator telling a story, maybe even a small choir of people singing along with the slideshow. And that's essentially what it is. It's a slideshow, but it's not a slideshow with photographic slides, but instead a slideshow with sort of illustrations on glass. And the most interesting one from my point of view is the phantasmagoria. Now, these things were sort of like a 19th century version of a horror film, right? You go on a date, maybe you take your new friend that you liked a lot, go out for an evening and have a dinner, and then go see the phantasmagoria together. And so these were usually single or small groups of people who would travel them from town to town to do them. And they would be there for a week, and every night at 7 we'll have a version of it. They were, they would use, you might have heard the term smoke and mirrors before, which is actually a real thing, because you can sort of use a mirror, a half silvered mirror, and some smoke to kind of give the illusion of a ghost in the room, and some other kinds of sort of special effects that were very popular in the stage at the time. The projectors themselves became more sophisticated, with having 2 projectors on top of each other. One would maybe be a sky and one would be a landscape, and the landscape might change, but the sky might stay the same, or something along those lines. The slides themselves became animated. And so you would have these kind of mechanical devices where if you turned the handle, like it would change from day to night in the scene, so that time would sort of evolve as it went along, or the lion's head or the tiger's head would growl, and they would have sound effects that go along with that. And so, and the magic lanterns themselves just became beautiful objects. And until recently, you could readily find these in junk sales and flea markets and things like that. But the phantasmagoria became a very sort of popular form of entertainment. Just like, I mean, I'm not the person, I don't really like horror films very much, but there is a subgroup of people who really love them. I know that. And I think it's kind of appeals to the same kind of group of people. And they used rear projections and front projections, and as I said, smoke and mirrors and special effects and sound effects and all these things to sort of entertain people. And this is an example of a ghost that's being using a half silvered mirror. That's the tilted mirror in the middle, and a projection onto a half silvered mirror. In the audience, it would appear like there's this kind of translucent person kind of floating in front of the stage, and it would be very scary and creepy for people. And so it was a really sort of like popular pastime before we had movies, right? Before we had any other than theater, which of course had been around for a long time. And this is a kind of theater, but it's sort of as a sort of step up from just people on a stage, because there would be projections and other kinds of things like that. So, as I said, they were handmade. You can see some of the color illustrations that were used in these at the time. And this is again prior to photography. So now we're going to start to move into how photography began. We knew about all these other things that were happening. The camera obscura, if you remember that video that we saw briefly, where one of the scientists, the French scientist, used silver, and he sort of wrapped a jar of silver with black paper and set it in the sun, and parts of the silver turned black, and the parts that were not allowed to see light stayed white because it was silver nitrate. And so one of the first people that really got interested in the idea of how to fix images from camera obscura was Thomas Wedgwood. And Wedgwood, you may not know him. I didn't really know him until I got married, but Wedgwood is a very famous China designer. So and a lot of people, when they get married, they have a list of things that they want, and China is one of the common things that goes into that sort of marriage list. And he was at the time, and still is, that his company is still one of the top makers of China. By China, I mean like teacups and saucers and fancy ass teapots and stuff like that, and plates and serving dishes and gravy boats and all those kinds of things that you have at a fancy meal. Since he was paying artists, now a lot of times this is the case, like entrepreneurs try to figure out how to not pay artists. His most famous themes were kind of nature themes on the plates and on the cups. And he had to pay an artist to paint each one of those by hand, individually, on each cup and on each plate and on each thing. And he's trying to figure out a way of not having to pay the artist. So he was doing research on how he could do that. And he sort of came up with this idea of a piece of paper that had been soaked in table salt and then dipped in silver. And then he placed an original leaf on that and then exposed it to the sun. And you got what we now call a photogram. Now, he didn't know how to fix it. And for anybody who's ever been in a dark room of any kind, fixing is the last stage where you remove the excess silver so that when you take the picture back into the light, it doesn't just turn black, right? So he never figured out how to fix it, but he did sort of figure out this much of it. And so here's the first picture that, I'm going to ask you to remember the name of the picture. I'm going to ask you to remember the name of the artist, and I'm going to ask you to remember the date, because this is the very first photograph. Now, I showed you this one, which was before it, but it didn't last. So I'm going to go. This one is generally called the first photograph. It's by an artist, a Frenchman called Nicephore Niepce, and it's a view out the window from his house at a place called Le Gras, which is just a city in southern France. So a view from the window at Le Gras by Nicephore Niepce in 1826. So here's the first real photograph. That is a date, a name, and an artist that you should remember vividly, right? Now, you can't see shit, I know that. I've actually gone to see it in person. It's in Texas right now, and my brother-in-law lives in Texas, so I had to go there, not by choice, but anyways, it was there. I went to see it, and it was worse than this. I mean, this is actually it's much more visible as what you're seeing than what I saw in front of the real thing, which is actually in like a little, kind of like a little tent, and it's all dark in there. And you've got this one tiny little light on it because it's still dark in it. Like, just like I said earlier, they never really figure out how to fix things very well. So this picture is like continuing to get dark. And so there's another reproduction of it. Try to explain what you're seeing. So the big V in the center, the big white V, well, that's like a courtyard. The two blobs on the sides, those are buildings coming up. The photographer is on the second floor looking down into the yard. Did somebody beep me? I just got a weird beep. Okay. So here's a better view of what we're seeing. So if you start at the bottom left, you'll sort of see what he was seeing. And that's what became the first photograph. Now he had a very different technique. He took a piece of metal, which was a very common kind of printing plate, a zinc plate, and he put this stuff called bitumen of Judea, just say tar. It was just tar. So he put a thin layer of tar on this piece of, it was really pewter, and he put it in a camera obscura, and he left it there for a day, like all day, like bright, sunny, southern France, middle of the summer, longest, hottest day of the year day. And he just left it open. And so what happens with that particular kind of tar is when sunlight hits it, it kind of hardens a little bit. We still use this in printmaking classes, by the way. So when you'll coat a plate, you'll expose it, you'll burn the plate, and then you'll wash away the part that wasn't exposed. This is the same stuff. So he used it in a camera, he left it in there all day. After it was done, he then washed the plate. The parts of the plate that had been struck by light, the tar had hardened, right? And the parts of the plate that had not been struck by light, the tar was still soft and it would wash away when he washed it in a sort of medium strong running water. And that was it. He coated it with tar, stuck it in a camera obscura, pointed it out the window for a day, washed it after that. And that's what he got, right? So here's another recreation of the back view from the window. And that's kind of the best recreations of it, the reproductions of it that I've seen. I've been there. It doesn't look at all like this, by the way. And so now, Yepsha figured that out. He also figured out that if you took a silver penny and you put it into a bath of salt water, and then you took a brush, there's the salt. And this is just table salt, by the way. It's like the stuff you put on your pizza or whatever you put salt on. And so there's nothing special about it. These two things combine into something called silver nitrate. So the nitrates are from the salt, and the silver is from the penny. And you get silver nitrate. You brush it onto a piece of paper in a dim place by candlelight, for example. And then you stick that into a camera obscura, like we've seen for the past 2 sessions. And then this one's got a fancy lens on it. Here he is putting it in the window at Le Gras. So they're actually going to use, they didn't have tripods back then, so they're just going to use a step ladder and open the window and leave it there all day, right? And ultimately, it darkens the paper in such a way that the places that the most light struck the paper go dark, the places in shadow don't go dark. What we see here is a negative. So this is really the first technique for making a negative. But still, at this point, they didn't know how to fix it. So within an hour or two, this will just disappear. The whole piece of paper will turn black and it will be gone. And so, for a long time, they knew that silver darkened upon being exposed to strong light. What they didn't know how to do was to stop it from continuing to darken, or fix it, as we call it now. Now, there was another process that was very popular early on as well. This one used iron, and it was used by a biologist, and she was a very unusual woman because, again, during the 19th century, women were generally not allowed to do this kind of thing, but she had a father and an uncle who encouraged her to study nature. And so she was studying algae, pond scum. Isn't that great? Let's go study pond scum, yay. And so she did a long-term study, a 10-year study on the different kinds of algae that were popular in Britain at the time. And she wanted to present a paper at the Royal Science Society in London about her studies. And so instead of making illustrations and drawings for the paper which she presented, she used this process called cyanotypes. Now, in some ways, you know, if we remember that the definition of photography is photos, light, graphis, write or draw, right? So light drawing or light writing, then this is a form of light writing, light drawing. She would, in this case, she wrote her text on a piece of tracing paper and then contact printed that in cyanotype materials. But most of the book, and there's about a dozen of these books. I've seen one of them in the British Library. And there was another one at the New York Public Library fairly recently. You know, these were her essentially illustrations for her talk about algae. And so she would lay the specimens, the algae, on top of the paper that's got the cyanotype mixture on. Again, it's a very simple combination of iron and another thing I can't remember at the moment, but and then she would set that out in the sun for a few minutes and then wash it off. And that was it. With cyanotype, you don't have to fix it. You just wash off the excess stuff and it will be permanent. It actually gets even more blue over time and much more violet. It's really beautiful. And so she didn't think of these as art, by the way, and I want to make that clear. I mean, we look back on them and sort of see these beautiful, they look like line drawings or sort of abstract paintings or something. But she thought of these purely as illustrations for her scientific study of algae. And
can I ask, is this like a byproduct from the algae?
No, it's just like it's like a shadow of the algae. So in other words, the cyanotype paper is the light sensitive part. Just like we saw in the leaf here by Wedgwood. He just laid the leaf on the paper, put it in the sun, and it darkened. It's the same thing here with the cyanotype process. You coat the paper with cyanotype material. It's a liquid, paint it on just like anything. You can actually dip it in if you want, and then dry it in the dark so it doesn't expose. And then she would lay the algae sample on top of the paper, stick that out in the sunshine. Where the algae was covering the paper, it stayed white.
Okay.
Where the algae wasn't covering the paper, the sun turned it blue. And then the algae gets thrown away because, of course, it doesn't last very long. And then what you get is this kind of like impression. She also did a project about ferns. And so some people, I think rightfully could say that a woman published the first book of photography, right? So that's a big deal, right? We've got a woman right here at the beginning of the history of image making, producing these beautiful books based on natural forms, right? And since it is essentially light that created the image, it is a kind of photography, right? It doesn't have a camera. I want to make that very clear. There's no camera involved in this process in any way. It's just lay stuff on light sensitive paper and do that. So here's another one of the very first photographs ever made. So there's all these people, different people coming up with different ideas. All these ideas. You ever heard the term zeitgeist? There's a kind of zeitgeist going on in the world. All these people are knowing, oh, we could probably do something with the camera obscura and maybe we should do something light sensitive. We know things are light sensitive. Let's get this to work together, right? And so here's this guy, Hippolyte Bayard, who he knew Niepce, and he knew these other two guys I'm going to talk about in just a minute, Daguerre and Fox Talbot. And he had come up with his own unique system for putting silver nitrate on a metal plate putting it into a camera obscura and making a picture, right? And so this was an idea that he had come up with. His so-called friends, Fox Talbot and especially Daguerre, suggested that he wait and not publish his process because he didn't want to be too hasty. And so, and then as you'll see in a minute, Daguerre patented his process first. And so this guy got no credit, he got no money, he got no fame, none of the things that go along with being the first inventor of such an important process. So this is a self-portrait of himself as a drowned man, which is a kind of protest. Now, he's not really drowned. I want to make that clear. It's not like a snuff picture. I'll show those later. But it is he was gardening in the sunshine. Back then they didn't have sunscreen, and his fair skin, he essentially got a terrible sunburn. He was wearing a long sleeved shirt, but his hands and his neck got sunburned. It's kind of what people look like when they get hanged. So he sort of staged this protest self-portrait using his own process that basically never went anywhere else, unfortunately. And this picture became his kind of protest that other people stole his. This, of course, what you see is that of Monsieur Bayard, inventor of the process that has just been shown to you. As far as I know, this indefatigable experimenter has been occupied for about 3 years with his discovery. The government, which has been only too generous to Monsieur Daguerre, has said it can do nothing for Monsieur Bayard. And the poor wretch has drowned himself. Oh, the vagaries of human life. He has been at the morgue for several days and no one has recognized or claimed him. Ladies and gentlemen, you'd better pass along for fear of offending your senses of smell, for as you can observe, the face and hands of the gentleman are beginning to decay. Now, this was actually written on the back of the picture as a kind of, it's kind of like a joke slash fuck you to Daguerre, right? And so, so then there's these two guys. And these two guys are the ones who are credited with inventing photography. And this is another one of those things I need you to write down and be very aware of. These two men, along with Anna Atkins. These are a couple of names that I'm going to want you. So we talked about Niepce, we talked about Anna Atkins, and now we're going to talk about Daguerre and Fox Talbot. And so these are the people right at the beginning of photography that have made such major contributions to the process of chemical photography that history has said these are the inventors of the process of photography, right? So Daguerre is in France, Fox Talbot is in England. They're both aware of what Niepce has done. As a matter of fact, Daguerre and Niepce met once and made a contract, an agreement to work together to further the advancement of photography. Unfortunately, Niepce died right soon after that meeting, and Daguerre never acknowledged what he learned from Niepce until we discovered it many years after he was dead. So, so these two guys. I'm going to start with Daguerre because Daguerre's process became the first accessible process for everyday-ish people to make a photograph. And so before Daguerre invented photography, he was into sort of like the phantasmagoria things. Remember, I just talked about those. He would make these really elaborate stages. He had actually invented a stage that the audience's seats would turn. So you could have a set on one stage, and then you'd change scenes, and there'd be another set ready. And so they could change that other set while you're looking at that one, and you could change back, and it'd be a different scene. And so it was like movie scenes, cut, 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 right? But it was done by actually rotating the audience to two different theater, like proscenium arches, right? The term. And so It was called a diorama, not like you made in the elementary school inside a shoebox with a cow or something, right? But the same idea is that it's a sort of fake world. And then there would be three-dimensional stuff, there would be actors, there would be sound effects, there would be projections, there would be smoke and mirrors and all that stuff. And he was a hell of a showman. He was like super famous, like one of the greatest directors are like, right? So he's known throughout Europe as like, oh, you got to go see Daguerre's show. It's great. Blah, blah, blah. And he was a really good marketer, and he was really good at sales and shit. So he talked himself up and got a great reputation. And then just like everybody else that I've mentioned, he didn't want to have to pay artists to draw and paint the sets, like background paintings, right? He wanted some way to mechanically reproduce background scenes without having to pay artists to do it. Well, that never actually happened because he couldn't make the pictures big enough, but he did come up with a way to make a photograph in a camera obscura. And his process, known as the daguerreotype, we can see on the left, we see a version of a camera obscura, right? This camera obscura has a lens attached to it. The picture on the right is the first surviving daguerreotype photograph. And you'll notice that a lot of the first pictures are not of people because the exposures were extremely long, like hours at a time, and people can't sit still that long. So the time that the camera lens had to be open to take the picture was so long that most of the early photographs are of objects, or still lifes, because they don't move, they don't run away, they don't, they don't blink their eyes, they don't breathe. And so, no, Daguerre's process was really clever. He took a piece of copper, a copper plate. This is the first photograph of a human being. Down in the lower left side, you'll see a circle or oval. There's a guy standing there having his shoes shine. And because it took a while and it might even be 2 or 3 guys, we don't know. But this is a boulevard in Paris, one of the most popular boulevards in Paris, a street. The street that you see would have been populated full of people along the promenading. That's what the French do, right? They promenade. They would have been promenading along the trees. There would have been horses and buggies and carriages going along the street. It would have been a very busy scene if you just looked out the window. But since the exposure was an hour, I don't know exactly, but a long time, those people all disappeared because they were there just for brief moments compared to the length of the exposure. But the guy having his shoes shined, he was there significantly long enough to appear in the picture. And so we consider this the first photograph of a human being. It's a daguerreotype. It's actually from Daguerre's window looking out onto a central boulevard in Paris. Now his process was, it was kind of cool and kind of actually deadly. So what he did was he took a piece of copper, very shiny, polished piece of copper. He silver plated that, right? Like cheap ass silver jewelry. It's like junk metal underneath. And then they electroplate a thin, like super thin layer of silver on top of the junk metal. That's exactly what this, and he polished out of it, right? And so it has to be, it's so shiny without a single flaw on the tape, on the plate. So we've got silver, thin layer of silver, and then polished. And what you do is you put that into a sort of box with a candle underneath it, and inside the box was iodine. Older folks will remember they used to put iodine in cuts just to make it hurt. Didn't do anything, we found out years later. Didn't help you in any way except it burned like, right? And so iodine. When you boil the iodine, the iodine gas would come up and it would hit the silver plated piece of copper, and there would be silver iodide on the surface of the plate. At that point, the silver has become light sensitive. And so you put that into a camera obscura and you open up the lens and you close the lens, depending on how long the exposure time is and how bright the light is, and you get a picture. And that picture is incredibly sharp, like so sharp that people thought the devil was in, like literally. like the clerics were thinking, because the more magnified you got, if you got a magnifying glass set, you can see more and more and more and more detail. You could see, like, read the signs a block away if you had a magnifying glass strong enough to see it. It's that fucking sharp, and it was amazing. Like, it still is amazing, honestly. Like, continues to be one of the very best resolving processes ever. So he invented this process, or sort of did, because he stole ideas from other people, but we say he invented the process. The state of France bought it from him. So they paid him a bucket of money, and they essentially said anybody can use it. And so,
Professor,
yes.
wasn't this also the time when more of this photography was being like renowned? Like people thought that they're like the superstitions started to come about, like the photograph was like stealing your souls or something.
Absolutely. And there was a lot of fear about it, but there's also a huge fervor. And you have to understand the sort of context of this. Now, prior to the invention of photography, other than having a silhouette made, which we saw on the first day, normal people like us that work for a living and like have jobs and don't have a lot of leisure time and a ton of money, we never had our pictures made. We never had portraits made. Only rich folks had their portraits made. So any paintings you see prior to the invention of photography is some sort of rich person or some sort of royalty or some sort of, basically probably the consort of a rich person. In other words, they're on the side person. And so that whole idea of having a portrait of yourself or your family member or somebody that you love made was totally foreign. Nobody even considered that. And now, I mean, it wasn't cheap. I want you to understand that. It still cost like about a week's worth of wages to have the daguerreotype made, but that's not outrageous, right? And so people could have portraits made. You could have a portrait of your mother or your grandmother or your lover or your kid or even your dead kid, which happened a lot back then. And so
Isn't I apologize for cutting you off, but isn't that where the mourning portraits came in?
they're called post-mortem, yes. But yes. And so this became a huge craze, and every street corner, just like bodegas in New York used to be, there would be a daguerreotypist, and they opened all these kind of daguerreotype studios all over the world, and it just became this huge craze. And so, and really, I mean, it's important to understand how sort of revolutionary this idea was, how foreign it was to a lot of people. As you brought up, it scared a lot of people in a lot of ways, because the closer you'd look, the more you'd see. And actually the lenses by this time were very, very sharp in the middle. I mean, well, as it went out from the middle, it sucked a lot. But the very center of these early Petzval portrait lenses were incredibly sharp. And so I'm going to show some examples of them. Now, after, you remember, you take this silver-plated copper, you put it on this box and you boil some iodine, which, by the way, is not very healthy. I want you to understand, breathing iodide is not good for you. You would take the picture in the camera, and then you would put it into another bath where they would, similar idea, there's a box with quicksilver. I always forget the name for that, the scientific name. The stuff that used to go into thermometers, what's that stuff called? Anybody remember?
Mercury, right?
Mercury.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
So they would have another box with mercury at the bottom. And the first ones, they would just leave it open until the picture appeared. But then they figured out that, okay, we can just take a short exposure and develop it. That was the new thing. Using a mercury bath, they could develop it out, and the exposures went from 15 minutes long in the brightest sunshine ever to 20 seconds long. And then they would develop it in a mercury gas bath. Now this killed thousands and thousands of photographers.
I was going to ask you that. How many people died from that?
Mercury gas is one of the worst things you can do to your body.
Isn't
they
that
didn't know this back then? And the other thing is hatters used to use,
The Mad Hatters.
yes, they would use mercury to shape the hats the same way, the gases of mercury, and that drove them insane. That's why they're called Mad Hatters. And photographers were the same. Many of the early photographers died mysteriously, but really it was from sort of inhaling so much mercury gas. So this is, I think this is New York. Now you'll notice that these things are in these very ornate kinds of boxes and frames. That's because, by the way, it may appear that there's color in them. It's not color. When they were so overexposed, like these guys' white shirts, it would turn that kind of purpley blue. There's an example of a post-mortem photograph. So, again, since this was such a new process, a lot of times people, when people would die, their family would take them to the daguerreotype studio and have a portrait done so that they could remember the way their dead loved one looked before they put them in the ground forever. And
Like they
so,
actually brought the body in for the
yes,
artist.
yes, yes. And it was very complex, actually. There's a whole subdivision of sort of early 19th century photography of just dead people, books and books and books about it. People collect it obsessively. So oftentimes they were children, which is really one of the saddest things in the world. There was a lot of, before we had vaccines, which work, children died young, often. My father's brother died when he was 8 from the flu. And it's like, it was common if families had 8 children, they'd lose 2 or 3. It was just before they became teenagers. And that was commonplace. So there's a whole sort of groups of pictures of people with their dead children. And then it got more and more what we call occupational daguerreotypes, where you would go into the daguerreotype studio with your like pickaxe and your pistol. This guy's probably, I'm just going to guess, he's probably going for the gold rush to the West Coast. He's leaving his young wife behind. And so he went and had a portrait made to give to her so she could, remember the way he looks while he's away, striking it rich in California, getting the gold, right? And the opposite would happen. The families would do portraits to give to their husbands when they went away to, I don't know, strike it rich in gold or work in a mine or go to another city to work in a factory or whatever it may be. And so, they became more and more creative. This is a young poet swooning with a fan. Along the route from the East Coast, which was essentially New York and Boston, to California, there were, during the sort of manifest destiny era of this country, which is really just taking shit from Indian Native Americans, they set up all these, places to feed and water and sleep your horses and stuff. And so sometimes daguerreotype studios would pop up in those as well. And look, I caught some butterflies. Yay, here's my butterflies. And so they just got weirder and like, look at my chicken, here's my chicken, it's an awesome chicken, right? And so they would just do weird shit, like, look at this pumpkin, it's huge. Who knows, like, I have a hat.
Professor,
Yeah.
it just amazes me as to how something that was so expensive and like used for like a select amount of people became like so commonplace that they would just start like taking photos of either like people in their occupation or just irregular everyday items of the time.
Well, I will admit, and I need to point out that it really went from very expensive right when it was invented to very popular. And when it became very popular, the materials, the cameras, right when it started, you essentially had to know how to make your own camera, how to make your own plates, how to make your own baths, mercury and iodide, etc. But then they became sort of mass produced, like you can go to the drugstore and buy a roll of film, or it became more and more easy and less expensive to do the process. But because the process was, if you remember, like I said, a very thin sheet of silver on copper plate, it's a very fragile process. And that's why they're in these elaborate cases. These cases are designed to protect the image from damage. Now, we're only seeing one half of the case in most of these pictures because the cases themselves were really elaborate. They're sort of, let me go back to the first picture. So here, you can see in the top left corner, you can see one. And so I'll be right back. So now we're going to try something that I've not tried before. So stop share. All right, so I'm going to switch cameras and I need to see myself. How do I see myself? Okay, so now go to speaker view, right? Yes. And so this is kind of what a daguerreotype case looks like on the outside. It's leather. It's got a very sort of elaborate latch on it. And the latch, you sort of unlock the latch. Like so, and then the daguerreotype case opens, right? And so now, the problem with the daguerreotype, as you can see, is that since it's on polished silver, everything reflects. And if it's in just the wrong angle, there's no image, and all you see is the windows in my studio. And so you have to get it just at the right angle to see the picture. Otherwise, it's just like you just see yourself, really. And so this elaborate kind of case, there's a layer of glass on top of the elaborate frame. And then this is padded. This side is padded so that it's soft and doesn't scratch the glass. And then it locks together with the sort of cute little latch there. And
It's almost
so
like a mirror.
it is. It's actually called, people called it a mirror with a memory. And so that was one of the nicknames for a daguerreotype, it was a mirror with a memory. And so whenever you see these exhibited or ever see them in person, you really have to kind of like move your head around, like to get into just the right spot to see it, to see the image. And so let me see, I'm gonna try a different angle on it. Let's see if this works any better. So,
Makeup type of kits that they have nowadays.
it's like a what?
Like makeup kits, like when you have
Oh
makeup.
yeah, like a compact, yeah.
Mhm.
So, all right, so, I mean, this guy's got a weird beard and these things are getting really expensive now. They didn't used to be, but now they are. Here's another one. This one, the case, you can see it's falling apart and it's actually broken on the bottom. I don't know if you can see that, but it's kind of cracked on the bottom and the spine is decaying. But the latch is still there, so I'm gonna open up the latch and I just broke it. And so here's another image, daguerreotype image. It's slipping out of the case, but you can only see me.
It kind of reminds me, I'm not sure what the actual word is. I think like those optical illusion photos or like paintings that you see where it looks like nothing straight up. And then when you turn to the right, it's like one image. And then when you turn to the left, it's like a completely different image.
Yeah, I've seen those. I know what you mean. having a hard time getting this one to be visible. It's falling out of the case, so I have to be extra careful with the. Yeah, now you're just seeing me. So anyways, that's kind of the, and also I think you can get a sense of the size, right? They're kind of hand sized. So they would easily fit in the palm of your hand. This is what's called a quarter plate, by the way. And we'll talk more about that sizing stuff in another sort of discussion. So I think now is a good time for us to do our break. So let's take a 15-minute break. We'll start again at 1:15. I'm going to have my lunch, so I won't be able to sort of answer any questions, but let's start again at 1:15 promptly, okay? Exactly. So the syllabus, where am I? Okay, there. And
Syllabus will load for me now.
it's a very large PDF document, so they will take a while to load. But
And I also have a quick question. I noticed that you are recording, Professor. I wanted to know, like, maybe for future reference, are we able to, you know, access those recordings, or is that just solely for your records?
well, the idea was that yes, you would, but they become like 400 megabytes each.
Oh, super big files, yeah.
All right, so I want to share my screen and I'll just show you on the syllabus. So, by the way, if you look too closely at Thanks Photography, that's a website that's at least a decade old. So, but anyways, on the syllabus weekly, you'll see a link to each one of the lectures here. And this will open a new window, which will have a very large PDF document of the lectures without the sound, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. I was clicking on the reading and links ones. I didn't realize we could click on the other one. Thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna get a lozenge. Okay, so that's what I haven't got to this week, and I just dropped it on the phone. All right, so getting back to the lecture itself, which is here, and stop the share. Instead, share this. So we looked at daguerreotypes and sort of noticed that they're rather fragile. The one thing that I didn't mention about them is that sort of like a Polaroid, there's only one. So if you remember, the metal plate that you make goes into the camera. And so that metal plate is the picture. There's no negative, it's not digital, so you can't make another copy of it. And so it's a unique and one-of-a-kind object that occasionally they were rephotographed to make copies of, but they really lost a lot of quality when that happened. Now, the main advantage of these is that they're extremely sharp. Even by today's standards, they're extremely sharp. So the disadvantage is that they're one of a kind. And so you should note both of those things in your notebook, because one of the advantages is they're sharp. One of the disadvantages is that they're one of a kind. And so they're fragile, meaning they have to be encased in those little jewel box cases and, you know, kept very carefully. And they're small. I mean, early photography was small in general. So there's this other guy in England. Yes.
Are these the pictures that you showed that you said are fragile and one of a kind, are they classified as daguerreotypes or just automatic, like early photography?
They're specifically daguerreotypes.
Okay.
So this guy, Henry Fox Talbot, lived in England. And as I said earlier, he had heard about some of these experiments and had been doing his own experiments with silver nitrate. He had built a number of camera obscuras, which his maid called mouse traps, and left them all over his estate. And so, you know, just like I said, that I'm sorry, the Nies or Niepce picture of the backyard at Le Gras was an important image to remember. This is another one. So lattice window, which is a Fox Talbot, what he called either a Talbotype or what eventually became known as a calotype. And it's calotype with a C-A-L-O-T-Y-P-E. Now, a little bit of background story. He was a sort of typical, you know, sort of English gentleman. He had an estate called, I can't believe I can't remember it now, but at the time, the way the government taxed rich people was by how many windows they had. It's a weird thing. The glass was so expensive. If you could afford to have lots of windows, that meant you could afford to have lots of glass, and that meant that you could afford to pay lots of tax. And so this picture is a picture of his window from inside the house, looking out, and it's kind of like him showing off his wealth, like, you know, like some guy with his fast car or his fancy watch or something. This is like, I can afford a bunch of windows. And so now this was made by on a piece of paper, which is a crucial thing to remember, as opposed to a piece of metal like the daguerreotype was. Lunch, I'll do this. As opposed to a piece of metal. And the paper that came out of the camera was inverted. In other words, it was a negative. And so he would then take that negative and put it in contact with another sheet of paper and shine light through the back of it and make a positive, which meant that you could make, at least theoretically, as many copies of the negative as you wanted. So one of the great advantages of the calotype or the Talbotype is that you can make multiple copies, you know, as many copies of the negative as you want. Now, it was silver nitrate. Remember the penny and the silver in the salt water? It was that. And he would take silver nitrate and brush it onto paper, put the paper after it dried into the camera, and then eventually figured out how to develop it and fix it. At the beginning, the only way he fixed it was he used a lot of extra salt water. Didn't last very long, but finally somebody came up with this stuff called fixer. And that person we're going to talk about in a slightly different context. So I'll leave that to be a mystery. But so the calotype, the Talbotype, had a great advantage of it being reproducible. So here's an example on the left of the negative that would have come out of the camera obscura, and then the contact print of the negative to make the positive, which again, you could make as many copies of the negative into positives as you wanted, as long as you didn't damage the negative. Now, it was, again, a very slow process. So it had to be usually done in bright sunlight. Oftentimes, if there were people in the pictures, they would have their heads turned away from the camera or be so far away you couldn't see their faces. Now, one of the disadvantages of this process is that since it's on paper, and since the paper has texture to it, the texture of the paper gets printed also with the information. And so it's not as sharp as the daguerreotype. Remember, the daguerreotype was extremely sharp because it was the piece of metal that was in the camera. This is a print from a negative, a paper negative, and is not as sharp as a daguerreotype. So we've got advantages and disadvantages of both processes, right? We have the daguerreotype, which is sharp. It's that's its main thing, right? It's sharp. It's fragile. I mean, these are papers, so they're kind of fragile, but not like a daguerreotype where if you touched it once, that fingerprint is there forever. So
it came out grainy.
It's not grainy because the prints are made from contact printing. So at this point, we're not enlarging the negative to make a print. The calotype or the talbotype, the advantage of it was that it was reproducible, and the disadvantage was it wasn't very sharp. Now, here's another advantage of the daguerreotype, which I mentioned, and that's that France bought it, right? And they gave the licenses away for free. So anybody who wanted to do a daguerreotype could just open a shop, buy a camera and the chemicals, and start making daguerreotypes. Fox Talbot, on the other hand, chose to license his process. So you had to buy a license from Fox Talbot to use his process, meaning not only did you have to buy the camera and the chemicals and the equipment, but you also had to pay him a fee. And the fee was pretty high, actually. It was so high that not many people chose this process at the beginning because daguerreotypes were free and you didn't have to pay a license fee. So that's kind of the two processes. They both came up at almost exactly the same time. Although the daguerreotype was publicly announced first, it seems that Talbot had invented his process first, but was slow to publish it, trying to be very selective about who knew about it. So here's another negative and positive. There's the texture of the paper that I mentioned. So that you can see that the actual sort of fibers in the paper become printed. I actually liked Fox Talbot's imagery a lot better. These are his pictures that he made, and he's got more of an artistic vision, I think, than Daguerre ever did. Some of these are contact prints again, so he'd lay lace directly onto his silver nitrated paper. And he then took it to his camera to London and other places. Again, photographing things that don't move. If there are people in the pictures, generally they're going to be sitting down. They're going to be looking away from the camera in very bright sunlight. So so here's his sort of studio in process. He's doing portraits. Now you might be able to see there's a kind of ring behind the sitter's head. And I mean, there's a lot of sort of misunderstanding about this. They didn't actually clamp your head in place, but they did have a thing that you could sort of like lean back against to keep your head steady. But it wasn't like screwed in and clamped on the back of your skull or something. And you can see if you do move, this is the kind of thing that you get. So the pictures had to be taken in very bright sunlight because the process initially was a printing out process, which meant they didn't develop it yet. And finally, they invented a way or figured out a way to make a latent image and then develop that image out. So these are some pictures he did while he was in Scotland, which are some of my favorites of his. They also began to tone the paper using, in some cases, gold and other things to make the pictures more stable and more permanent. So Daumier is best known as a sort of a man who invented the caricature. And caricature, of course, you can have them done when the world is normal. You go to Central Park and some artist will draw you with like a big nose or a skateboard that's gigantic if you're a skateboarder. Some aspect of you will get exaggerated in a caricature. And so Daumier noticed the popularity of the the photography of the daguerreotype studios, and he made this this caricature of Paris being just full of photo studios, and Nadar, who was the most famous of all of the portraits daguerreotypists, flying over the city in his hot air balloon. Now, Nadar was kind of like the Annie Leibovitz of his time, if you know who she is. Like every generation has a kind of like photographer of the stars, like, you know, and he was kind of the first one. Like you're not anybody until you're photographed by Annie Leibovitz these days. And if you're photographed by Annie Leibovitz, well, you must be somebody. Although I really don't like her work that much, but that's beside the point. He was kind of that first famous, the man who photographed and documented the famous people at the time. But he also photographed in the Paris catacombs and other places. So these are some of his earlier portraits of kind of the famous folks at the time. This is a poet named Doré, a cinematographer. This is a beautiful portrait of Baudelaire and a self-portrait of Nadar. Nadar is also famous because when the Impressionist painters couldn't get into the show at the famous museum, they had their Salon de Refusé, right? If you know about that, the first Impressionist painting show, it was at Nadar's studio. So Nadar was right down the street from the Academy, and they went the Impressionists sort of took their paintings down to him, and he put the exhibition on. So, so these are some of Nadar's portraits. Now, the sewers and the catacombs under Paris are where a lot of the World War II, resistance met to plan their resistance to the Nazi invasion. Sarah Bernhardt was one of the more famous theater actresses at the time, and of course George Sand, the poet, and his wife. So ambrotypes. I'm sorry, I got this thing. Sure. Okay. Right, so ambrotypes. Now, these two processes that I just talked about are considered the first photographic process. They both had advantages and disadvantages. So people continued to think about different ways to make pictures. And the next really popular process that came along had sort of the advantages of both of the processes. In other words, it was sharp, and it was also reproducible because it made a negative. Now, it was a process that used this stuff called collodion. Now, collodion is it's kind of like thick, like honey, and it's actually made out of gun cotton, which is the stuff that in old muskets and old cannons, they put gunpowder in, and then they put wadding, which was just cotton, and then they put the musket ball or the cannonball, and that stuff in between was called gun cotton, and it would get a sort of residues of the gunpowder on it, and if you mix that with silver nitrate, it made this kind of goo, and you could pour this goo onto glass, and then that glass was put into the camera while it was still wet. It had to still be wet, and you would take the picture. The exposures were much faster, but you had to have your darkroom with you, and you had to process the piece of glass before it got dried up. And so you pour this sticky goo on it. I have a video of it in a minute. And it sort of goes in the camera as it is, and then you can process it. And what you get is a negative on glass, which means you can make as many prints of it as you want. And it's very sharp because it's glass and not paper like Fox Talbot used. I'm going to show this. It's sort of out of place, I'm sorry. But this pair of photographers were working in Scotland. And because Scotland thinks itself, and it still thinks itself this way, is not part of England or the UK, they didn't give a shit what Fox Talbot licensing fees were. And so they just did what they wanted with Fox Talbot's process without paying him. And they made some of the earliest, most beautiful portraits ever, really. I mean, these are just amazing portraits using the calotype process, landscapes. Most famously, they photographed all the members of the Scottish Parliament. And then Robert Adamson was also a painter, and he made this massive painting of all of the senators in the Scottish Parliament from the photographs. But these are some calotypes that were made in Scotland. So, you know, we talked about the camera. How'd this get back in here? It's too late. We already did this. Okay, so I'm just going to go sort of from early camera obscuras, right, to the first daguerreotype cameras were a sliding box. And this was the shutter, by the way. You would sort of open this little sort of like slot on the front to cover the lens, and then you cover it back again. So then we went on to large scale studio cameras to use with the wet collodion process. These were foldable. They had a bellows. You'd sort of lift that black cloth over your head and get inside. And what you would see was the image upside down and backwards. I still use a camera like this, by the way. Many photographers do. Not exactly, I don't have brass lenses on it or anything, but, and you would compose on this piece of ground glass and then put the calotype, I mean, the collodion negative into the camera, make the exposure, and then process it. Now, this was the first Kodak camera. This is the Brownie. And this is the first, it's a Brownie 1, actually it's number 2. It was the first camera that was, you know, I call them idiot proof, right? It had one feature: you press the button. And their marketing slogan at the time was, you press the button, we do the rest, right? They sent you, you bought the camera, it cost $2, which by the way was, back then was quite a lot of money. It was loaded with the first kind of film that was flexible and came in a roll. And you would take 100 pictures with the camera. It doesn't have an aperture, it doesn't have shutter speed, it doesn't have a light meter, it doesn't have anything except it actually had a string to pull to take the picture, and you cranked up to the next picture. Now these were marketed to women, right? You see on the right, the typical Kodak girl. I'm going to talk about those in another lecture, but this was sort of aimed at sort of youngish, you know, 20-something women to be kind of exploratory and go out in the world with their cameras to photograph the world alone without having to know anything about the technical stuff. Later, after that, came the Leica camera. Now, the Kamoinge group that we saw and talked about earlier today, this was their favorite camera. And in the group portrait, you'll see a number of them holding up their Leica, because this was the first camera that used 35mm roll film. It's very small, it could fit in your pocket. You could shoot 36 pictures without having to reload. It was very quiet, so it had a cloth shutter, so when you pressed the shutter button, you didn't really hear anything. And the lenses were extremely good. So this camera really made street photography like the Kamoinge group did possible, because you didn't have to have it on a tripod. You didn't have to carry your darkroom around with you. This is a new kind of photography, called it miniature photography. And it was very sort of exciting for photographers at the moment to be able to be so free to move around. The only ever great American-made camera was the Argus. It looks like a brick because it is. It's basically a heavy piece of metal. It's the camera that Jimmy Olsen used in the Superman comics, if you ever noticed that Jimmy Olsen was a photographer. It was really aimed at an amateur market in much the way that the Kodak Brownie was. The Graflex became the camera of choice for news photographers. And we're going to do a whole session about sort of news photography and photography as fact. But this was the first SLR style camera, meaning that you looked through the lens that took the picture. And so you would look down from above. There was a mirror at 45 degrees in the camera, and it let you see through the lens, and that's how you would focus. And then when you press the shutter button, the mirror would slap up and the film would be exposed. And so then standard 35 millimeter SLR cameras came along. The Contax was the first one. It had that same kind of mirror, but it wasn't a huge box. It was small and could easily be handheld. And these were all sort of versions of the first SLR style cameras.
Sorry, Professor, can you go back to the other one?
Which one?
The one right down.
Oh,
Just wanted to write the date.
did you have a question about it?
No, I just wanted to write the date for the contacts.
Okay.
Can you go to the next? Yeah, down. Thank you.
I'm not going to ask you to identify cameras. I just wanted to show you sort of how they became more and more sort of handheld, more and more portable, more and more easy to use. The Nikon F being really the first kind of popularized SLR style camera that many soldiers sort of brought back from Japan at the time. So the rise of the Japanese camera manufacturers, the Germans were still very making the best cameras, the Leica style cameras, but Nikons and Canons, both from Japan, became more accessible to the average consumer. This one is sort of, a moment in time that's unique. Edwin Land invented the Polaroid camera. And essentially he sort of had an idea like, wouldn't it be nice if I could see the picture right after I took it? Wow. I mean, to us, that's of course, like, that's what our phones do. There's no delay. But he just had this idea, like, it'd be great if I could just take the picture and look at it. And he was kind of like the Steve Jobs of his time, if you know who he is, the sort of Apple guy, the inventor of all the Apple gizmos. He kind of like was this brilliant, both scientist and chemist and engineer. And so in like one long weekend, he went into his lab and never left and came out on Monday with the Polaroid camera, complete, and invented it in like 3 days. And so
wow,
when the Polaroid camera came out, it was revolutionary. Like the whole world was like, wow, that's so cool. And the first cameras, again, were very expensive when they were initially made. They were a kind of version of an SLR style camera. And the film at the time was a peel apart film. So you pull it out of the camera and then you wait 60 seconds and peel it apart. It had this great smell to it. And then the image would be in front of you, finished. They were in black and white initially, but then he made them in color. And so then along came so-called digital photography, right? This is not really a digital camera. It's actually a video camera, but they had these kind of like floppy disks. They were like 2 by 2 inches, and it would just grab a single frame of a video still, and they were just horrible. I mean, just horrible. Like if you ever freeze video, especially old school analog video, it's just terrible. But we started to move away from film into these kinds of devices. Now, this is the very first digital camera. It was invented at Kodak. It was cobbled together with a cassette tape player, some circuit boards that this guy Sasson made, and a Nikon lens. The first picture he took was of his son, a baby. And so typically Kodak picture, right? Babies and dogs and sunsets. And he showed it to his bosses and they said, that'll never go anywhere. And Kodak completely ignored this. And so even though Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975, digital photography essentially drove them into bankruptcy because they never sort of picked up on the digital revolution in time. And they were sort of ended up going into bankruptcy. They're not really bankrupt, they still exist, but they've been broken up into smaller parts. So This was the very first commercial digital camera. I actually had one at my old college. You basically carried a car battery, like a CRT, like small television, and this Nikon that had been modified by Kodak, and it had a 640 by 480 resolution, and then it went up to 1280 by 1024. It was $40,000. It took really low resolution pictures, but you could go to a sporting event or a disaster somewhere. You could take the pictures, you could modem them back to your newspaper or magazine, and they would be there in a few minutes, as opposed to the old style photojournalism where you had to shoot the pictures, process the film, make the print, put the print onto this rolling device to send it back to the news editor. And so this meant you could watch the final quarter of the Super Bowl, or you could be at the fire until they put it out, instead of having to leave to go back to your photo lab to process the film or whatever it may be. And so photojournalists, newspapers, magazines, back when those things existed, really bought these, and that's how digital photography really came along. By the way, it was actually invented by NASA to photograph the Russians, but that's a whole other story. So then we came to the first sort of portable-ish digital camera, professional digital camera, the Nikon D1. And this lecture is really about how technology has sort of shaped photography. So I'm kind of showing you a wide variety of devices and techniques and things that were sort of the origins of how photography came about. And so the other thing that was happening in the late 19th century, although fairly early as well, was the idea of moving pictures, right? And so films, movies. Early moving pictures were very small devices that had short little, 20 frame sort of things that would happen, somebody jumping over something, a chair or something. And so when you spin the drums, you sort of look at it from the side, and you can see here that as you look through the slots, the sort of still pictures on the opposite side, kind of somebody crawls up a ladder, right? Or you can make them still, but so these things were very popular as sort of party tricks. The Kenora down here at the bottom left is a series of still pictures, kind of like a flip book, that you would kind of like turn a handle and it would flip through all the pictures, and you would see a little photo play happen in front of you. All these great words, right? The praxinoscope, which is a mirrored device that allows you to sort of look into the reflection of these strips of paper.
Are these Greek words?
Oh, I don't know. Probably Latin somewhere, but also kind of made up. And again, I'm not going to ask you to identify a phenakidoscope from a Kenora or a praxinoscope. So you don't have to actually remember the details of each one of these things. The point is that this is the beginning of cinema. So this is how movies sort of started. A bunch of still pictures seen quickly together, and it seems like it's moving. So then along came this thing, the penny arcade, basically. These things became very popular. There were sort of like arcade games used to be in the 80s. You would go into these little shops. There would be a few of these around. You'd drop a nickel in, or you drop a penny in, and you turn the handle and you'd see a little movie, like it's silent, by the way. And it would be a sort of a funny thing, like a copper trying to catch a criminal and the criminal tripping the copper. There would be like silly little things. So this became a very popular kind of entertainment that people would go and sort of watch these little movies together. Then, of course, with every technology comes along erotica, right? And so some of, especially photographic technology, often tends to be used for erotica early on. And so we see that these penny arcades also began to show scantily clad women doing silly things. that they got more and more ridiculous. So there's all kinds of different. Ashley, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, didn't I think it's Edward Weybridge have a big part in them like moving
Yes.
as well?
And we'll get to him, I promise. Absolutely, but you're absolutely correct.
Okay.
And so, so there's simple ways to do these. And all right, so I'm gonna go for about 3 more minutes. Again, this was the Kodak camera. The very first Kodak was a box camera like this. And you would buy it with the film in it, shoot all the pictures, send the box back to Kodak. They would process and print your pictures, and then they would reload the camera for you, and you would get it back. So I have just a couple of those. So the earliest Kodak Brownie pictures were actually made. Can't find my cursor. And there we go. All right, so so the earliest Kodak pictures were actually round, and that was because the lenses like fell off so badly at the corners that they didn't want to print it all the way to the edge. And so you would see just kind of like a circular picture in the middle of a piece of card. And so those are the earliest Kodak pictures, the sort of amateur style photography. Of course, photographers lamented that, oh my God, there's no more, the profession's dead because anybody can take a picture now. Just like they still say about iPhones and stuff, but it's not true. So, all right. I need to stop here. So thank you all. As I mentioned last week, my wife comes in right after me to teach a class for BMCC. So I need to log off immediately. If you do have questions, please do send them to me. And this chat was fantastic. I didn't get to follow it, but I'm going to read it after class. And I love that you guys are really interacting over there. I think that's great. And all right.
Quick question.
Yes.
Before next week, we just following the syllabus, right? So whatever's let me see. I think it says something about
Watch a video.
yeah, watch the YouTube video and radiolab.org. So we just do that for next week.
Yeah, so there's also another maybe 5 or 6 links there. There's photo processes from GEH. There's Getty photo processes.
Yeah.
Photography changes everything. Timeline of photo technology. So yeah, just all those links. Have a look at them. If they're videos, watch them.
All right.
There's no specific assignment. Nothing's due this week. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Thank you. All right.
So much, Professor.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Wow.